Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with veteran Emporia, Kansas-based jazz singer Janice Borla. She is often cited for her adventurous, risk-taking approach. We get into her philosophy, the road to now, the future, and so much more. This is definitely a singer that continually challenges herself, keeping vocal improvisation front and center in her performances. With each successive recording, she drills deeper into the musical approach that has distinguished her from so many of her contemporaries. We cover some great ground in this interview with the master of jazz. Enjoy. Thank you, Janice, for taking a minute out. It's great to connect.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you today.
So before we get into your life and music, how did you survive COVID? I know it was particularly difficult for the musician community. How did you get through that time period, and how has it changed the way that you do things now?
Well, wow, it was challenging to be sure. We lost the ability to be in person on every level. So all performing and teaching activities had to go online. And so really, like it or not, we all needed to get on board with the online tools, that we had, available as soon as possible. It was tough, of course, to be isolated and all of that. But I think that out of that whole period of lockdown, the most significant work we did actually was a result of that very challenge of having to function in lieu of in-person events. And I guess I should mention here that last September, my husband, who's jazz drummer Jack Mouse, and I moved to Emporia, Kansas, his hometown, but we were living in Naperville, Illinois until then. And so at this point in the spring of 2020, we were in Naperville, and the Rotary Club of Naperville approached Jack and me about producing an online event to replace its annual fundraiser, which was usually held in person. And what came out of that was something we called Jazz Quilt, which aired in October of 2020. And it was an hour-long fundraising event, if you wish, for Rotary. And we functioned as the artistic directors. And so we assembled a group of 6 wonderful jazz artists to present solo performances from their respective locations. So we had tenor saxophonist Scott Robinson from Teaneck, New Jersey, guitarist Fareed Haq from, he's based in Chicago for many years, pianist Pat Coyle from Nashville, bassist Larry Gray from Chicago, and Jack and me from Naperville. So, and of course, we were really naive about this thing to begin with. We're like, okay, kind of like reminds me of Mickey Rooney, and let's put on a show. So while it was our original intention to stream live, it became immediately apparent that it would be way safer to pre-record this because there were so many moving parts. So what we ended up with was each musician submitted a pre-recorded solo performance about 3 to 5 minutes long. And then it was edited together into an hour-long program hosted by the Rotary president and the president-elect, and Jack and I introducing each of the artists. Now, this was filmed in our basement studio by Naperville Community TV production crew. It was all very, very amazing. And prior to the taping, we also produced a finale segment that combined all of us playing together, but not really. In other words, everybody layered their provided their part. We layered them in one by one. And then, eventually the bottom line was we looked like we were playing simultaneously. It was quite a wonderful sleight of hand. And, overall, the benefit was very successful for them. It raised over $76,000 in sponsorships and online donations. And this all went toward mental health awareness and domestic abuse, which at that point was already on everybody's radar as being, crucial and very problematic. And in fact, it's still online. You can be viewed on YouTube by just Googling Jazz.
That's wonderful. So let's get into your history. How did the jazz get into you? How did the jazz roots begin? What were some influences for you?
Well, it's an interesting journey because, I trained as a musician early on in my life and spent many years, functioning well in studying and listening to music But my household was not necessarily, jazz was not on our radar at all, to be honest with you. I was born and raised in Chicago and the western suburbs. I mentioned that both my parents came from Poland through LSI back in those days of immigration. And I mentioned it just because it to give a context for the fact that my first instrument was accordion. Now, these days we look at that and of course it caused me sources of embarrassment for years after that. But at the time, when I was studying and growing up in the 1950s and early 60s, Chicago had an influx of Italian and then Polish immigrants. And so the accordion had this amazing moment where it was hugely popular for, dozens or so years that I can remember. I studied in a school with 3 locations and hundreds of students and bands in each of the locations. And I played in an accordion orchestra that played classical works that were rescored for accordion. And in fact, many of the Chicago pianists of my generation began as accordionists, as it turns out. So we all sort of found each other in the music business later on as we collided with one another. But the reason I bring it up is the fact that it combined a traditional piano keyboard on the right hand with this amazing set of buttons on the left. I don't know if you know anything about it, but vertically it's set up in the circle of fifths. And horizontally from right to left or left to right, in and out, it gives you all the sets of chord, different chord families and a couple of rows of single bass notes. My point being that even better than the piano, it was an amazing instrument to learn and to absorb harmony on. I spent many of my years studying, writing out, and I studied with my teacher had been a graduate of DePaul University in composition and whatever. And so he was the one who was kind of reinventing all this music from the classics into accordion. And he put me in a 2 or 3 year regimen of writing out and playing every freaking chord progression, scale arpeggio in 2 octaves that anybody ever imagined. And at the time, it was for dexterity and technique on the instrument. But what I harvested from that years ago, years after that, was the fact that I had miraculously absorbed all this harmonic information. And so after school was over and I began working and delving more into the music, I found initially that my transference into jazz was really organic, because the formulaic changes that were given me in standard song forms and so forth were like, well, this is pretty easy. I don't really see what the fuss is about, frankly. It was a matter of learning the rhythmic language and the idiomatic language, but I had the basic harmonic stuff like knocked because it was in my bones from so many years back. But in the meantime, I went to U of I for graduate school. I graduated college with a BA in music, or voice and musicology. And I went on to U of I in musicology. Long story short, it wasn't a good fit. And it took me my experience there to realize that I wasn't going to be a musicologist. I was in fact going to be a performing artist. But in the meantime, it gave me a couple of really vivid experiences that were, I think, really, that started taking me over to jazz. Well, one, not necessarily directly, but it was the fact that I sang for 3 years in a contemporary avant-garde new music vocal ensemble. And for me, this is really adventurous because there's nothing I'd ever experienced before. Very abstract music. I learned how to use straight tone for the first time in my life at that point. And it planted a taste for experimental music that I've carried forward ever since. The other experience there was with the U of I big band. It was my first significant jazz encounter, if you will, live. And that was really coming from hanging out with the guys in the band. We were taking courses together, so we'd hang out at the Thunderbird, we'd have lunch, we'd have, go for drinks. And I was really drawn to them because, unlike the rest of my peers, they were actually performing and they were out gigging, and I was really excited about that. I got to sing with the band a couple of times, and it was my first good dose of instrumental jazz music. So in the early 70s, I returned to Chicago, and gosh, it was a very dynamic music scene in those days. There were so many opportunities, an array of live entertainment venues, nightclubs, supper clubs, showrooms, convention facilities, hotel ballrooms, scores of lounges with a trio and singer featured. So it was fairly easy to sort of start jumping in and getting involved in that situation. My first actual professional gig that went for a while was playing and singing in a show band, a cover band of Chicago tunes. And that's when I learned how to comp on piano. So that was a learning skill that was added at that point. I worked for Playboy about 5 years in Chicago, Lake Geneva, and Atlantic City. They were very, very receptive to jazz. Hugh Hefner was a big jazz fan. And even though it was an interesting experience, because that was a moment in time when women were confronting the whole sexual, stereotype of Playboy clubs. But, I just blew that right off. And my job was to perform either in the small lounges with a jazz trio or in the large showrooms, opening for, comics of that generation that were popular then, Frank Gorshin and Charlie Callis and Shecky Green and all of that. So, this was a time when we were all, if you will, I was singing in a jazz style. I wasn't necessarily aware that I was a jazz vocalist at that point. But in 1984, I met my husband, Jack. We met on a gig. We immediately connected based on our musical simpatico. And it was the beginning of a partnership that really, when I look back on it, helped shape the course of my career as I transitioned to jazz singing. I think he was the first one who brought to my attention, hey, wait a minute, this, you should be looking at jazz. You have all the skills, you have all the knowledge necessary to do this well. Let's look at it. And so sure enough, we went in that direction. The very next year, I released my first album, Whatever We Imagine. Leonard Feather gave it 4 stars in the LA Times. We did a lot of touring on that album. And then I think one more component that I feel is really crucial to who I am as a musician, and that is that in the late 80s, Jack and I were invited to help design a college jazz studies program from the ground up. And once involved in that, jazz singing and teaching became intertwined for me in a very, very, very important way. Teaching has had an impact on my entire evolution as a jazz musician. I think a crucial component was that about a year into that, I was asked to design and deliver the jazz history course. And I thought at the time, heck, I don't know a thing about jazz, really. This is going to be a heavy lift. But, I worked through it, and boy, I'm so glad I did, because it changed my life. It made me realize, as a vocalist looking at jazz, it was a little bit like, how do I fit into this? And I realized with, kind of hitting me with like a brick on the head, that it was a totally instrumental genre. And the role of the singer within it was fairly marginal, to be honest, apart from a couple of looming presents like Ella Fitzgerald and Sarah Vaughan and the like. So over time, I kind of gravitated toward, I left the vocal standards behind a bit and started looking at the jazz standards. And so I started with tunes that already had lyrics created, like Equinox and Very Early and Beauty and the Beast, Ask Me Now. And then I, started delving more into jazz tunes without lyrics, thinking, well, maybe I'll write my own lyrics. And I did some of that. I wrote lyrics for Bill Evans's Five, Remembering the Rain. I wrote a lyric for Black Narcissus that I think is the official lyric. And, now I feel very conversant with working, if you will. My repertoire consists of mainly instrumental tunes by instrumental composers, with a mix of, some have lyrics, some don't. I'm happier and happier as life goes on, dealing with tunes that don't have lyrics. I feel like, my thought is always this: if a trumpet player, for instance, can play a ballad and improvise on it, why can't I? I mean, why do I have to sing a lyric? Particularly if it's a standard, you know what I mean? And so I began to look at myself through the lens of an instrumentalist and to approach my music that way. The other takeaway from the jazz history experience was improvisation. I hadn't been really improvising until then. I mean, certainly melodic embellishment, meaning I knew how to stretch a melody and work with the melody within the jazz idiom, both rhythmically and melodically, but I hadn't actually delved into non-verbal scatting, you know. And so I began to mess with that. And so then again, that opened up a whole new world for me. And now I'm a complete, what's the word? I preach the gospel of improvisation whenever I can.
Excellent. Excellent. So, you know, you've been at this for quite a while. I'm curious, what is it that you like the best about being in this profession, in the world of jazz and being a musician?
It's challenging always. In other words, or at least I try to keep it challenging always. I like to think that I'm constantly evolving and that I'm constantly looking for new challenges within the music. You know, I mentioned earlier formulaic changes that vocal standards have, and like I said, as long as I stayed in that realm, it was pretty easy to just intuitively improvise. But once I started working with jazz tunes that were written by jazz composers who maybe used different kinds of harmonic devices, well, then my life became a little more complicated, and so I, you know, then I had to start really dealing with jazz harmony. And that, of course, is its own life journey. I think the other thing about it is that I just, you know, you're constantly working with new people and the challenge of, you know, so much of the time you put a band together for something and, you know, it's like herding cats. You book them and they're all ready to go. And then all of a sudden somebody comes along and says, I can't make it for this reason. And, you know, or I never could make it and you'll have to replace me. And so you're constantly, you know, personnel is constantly shifting, changing. And you know, that brings a new chemistry to the group, which entails a different kind of way to approach them and the music and all that. And again, I think, the idea that improvisation is essentially, you know, this feeling that no matter what happens next, you have the confidence to see your way through it. And so if you look at it that way, every jazz performance gives you that opportunity to see what new can I come up with? I mean, particularly with tunes that you've done a long time, you know, over and over again. What new can I bring to the table today that I did? I don't want to do the same thing twice, obviously. And there are things that we all develop, mannerisms or things that we like to do in particular tunes that show up, you know, signatures or licks or whatever. But, it's still a matter of, no, I'm going to do something different this time. If it's the last thing I do, you know, and I find that terribly refreshing and inspiring on a daily basis, really.
So everyone out there has a perception of you, an idea of who they think you are, your family, your friends, and your fans, but ultimately you're the driving force. You lead the ship, so to speak. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Oh, gosh. I'm a small person of stature, but I have a big voice. I'm kidding. Well, you know, on a very overarching sense, my life's mission is to bring beauty into the world. I've always felt that. Creating and expressing beauty, it informs everything I do and has been the centerpiece of my music. I also, again, coming back to this idea of being an improviser, that is now who I am. I think that defines who I am. I recognize the huge impact that jazz improvisation has had on other aspects of my life. And actually, I see it in my students. The fact that the more that they are involved with jazz, They grow in confidence and they learn to think in the moment and problem solve and experiment and collaborate and overcome their fear of failure. And you know what? We're all dealing with those kinds of things. These are things that affect in every realm of our life. So, I mean, I have a couple of ways I can go from here. One is to maybe talk about what comes out of my passion for improvisation, and that is that in 2015, Jack and I established a 501c3 creative arts, and it came out of our goal or our desire to take improvisation beyond jazz to a wider community of practitioners. And we weren't sure how we were going to do that exactly, but we had this sort of vision of generally what we wanted to do, and which would be to, if you will, use our experience as musicians and educators to help people who don't consider themselves improvisers to better understand and utilize. Now, meanwhile, we had a chess encounter in 2018 with a group from Little Friends, which is a school in Naperville for children with autism. The Rotary Club of Naperville had brought them in to Jack's jazz combo to observe his rehearsal. And in the hour and a half we had, it rather turned into a vocal workshop. He invited me to come up and talk about vocal improvisation. I did some things with the audience, back and forth, trading fours and so forth. And then I invited one of them to come up and join me. Well, so sure enough, one of the hands went up and there was this young man, about 14, from the school who came up and was willing to try this. And we got through it and he was great. And then all the other hands went up. And so we went around and did this several more times. But meanwhile, Jack was standing in the back of the room when all this went down. And he was standing next to a staff member, apparently. And he noticed that she was wiping her eyes. And he said, well, are you okay? Is anything wrong? And she said, that young man that's singing with Janice right now hasn't said a word in class for 2 years. And I think at that point we realized, wow, maybe we're onto something. And so we met with Rotary about it, and we ended up creating, if you will, a program where we went over to Little Friends every couple of weeks during the school year that year and worked with a couple of their middle school music classes. And just with Jack and I and a piano player, we dealt with vocal improvisation, drum sounds, the blues scale, blues licks, and so forth. And we had a great time with them. They were wonderful. They were very responsive. They did so well, in fact, that we featured them on our student jazz concert at the end of the school term, and they brought the house down. And so what Jack and I really, and of course COVID then put an end to that. I mean, stopped it in its tracks a year later, and frankly, we never got back on board because by then our lives had changed, and then we ended up moving, and so that's done. But Jack and I, nonetheless, whenever we go out, let's say we were in Kansas here a couple of years ago to do a concert, and after sending the band home, we stayed a few days more, and we arranged to do a series of workshops for various groups in town. Folks with disabilities of all kinds, not just autism. And we we actually presented 7 workshops in one day, with one with each different group. It was exhausting, but it was so much fun. And we try to do that whenever possible. We always offer that as an option, free of charge, to the venue or to the grant or to the presenting organization.
That's wonderful. I have a son who's on the spectrum, and he's 18 now, so I've been in the special needs community for quite a while. So I always appreciate that. Janice, if anyone out there wants to pick up your recordings, learn about live music, anything that you're doing, where's the best place for them to go?
My website, obviously, it's just janiceborla.com. And there they can find my bio and information about the recordings. There are some music samples on the, each of the albums. Trying to think of what else is there. Jack's in the background going, Amazon. Yeah, I think probably Amazon would be still the best source to actually purchase music. I'm listed on iTunes and so forth, but in terms of actually buying a CD, if anybody still wants to do that.
They're out there. I love listening to it in the car. Janice, thank you so much for taking time out today to open up your world and what's going on and your history. It's been fascinating. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest singers and players in Emporia, Kansas, Kansas City, Missouri, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. Thanks to Janice for her time, energy, and cool. You can find more Neon Jazz interviews on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Subscribe to us at YouTube, and for everything Neon Jazz, go to theneonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.